Should we wait a couple more minutes? Oh,
Yeah, maybe just 1 minute. I think we're getting pretty close here.
okay.
Maybe just one minute for folks who are just joining.
Okay.
And Bella, if you could let Nathan into the meeting, I think he's here for Parks, and then Emily Brock just joined as an attendee. So both of those, if we could get them promoted to a panelist, that'd be great.
Yeah, I promoted them as panelists. I think they have to accept.
Okay, great. We'll just wait for that.
Looks like they're in.
Perfect. I think we're close enough probably now to critical mass and quorum. Cora, if you want to go ahead and get us started.
Okay, we will call the meeting to order at 10:02. For the public that are joining us, you can register or join the webinar at missoulapublicmeetings.com. And if you want to make public comment in the meeting, in the Zoom meeting, you can raise your hand, or if you're on the phone, you can dial *9 to raise your hand and then *9 to lower your hand on there. With that, we will get started on our agenda. I assume we've taken roll call by who's in the Zoom meeting itself, or do we need to call official roll call?
I'll do roll call if that's all right.
Okay, go for it.
All right, Shane Stack. Sarah Cofield.
Present.
Corey Aldridge.
Present.
Ellen Buchanan. Aaron Pehan. Jacqueline Smith.
Present.
Chet Krauser.
Karen Hughes, proxy for Chet Krauser.
Thank you. Juniper Davis.
Present.
Donna Galker.
Nathan McLeod, filling in for Donna.
Thank you. Ryan Hammond.
Present.
Lynn Hellegard. Jeremy Keene. Ben Weiss.
Present.
Tiffany Brander.
Ian Ortley, present. New Parking Commission Director.
Oh, that's right. Ian Ortley.
Present.
Thank you. Brian Elstad.
Present.
Bynum Jackson. Eva Rock. Katie Potts. Emily Brock.
Present.
All right, did I miss anybody? All right, good to go then.
Okay, great. We'll move on to agenda item number 2, approval of the minutes. Do I have a motion to approve? Not all at once.
This is Shane Stack. I'll move to approve minutes.
Right. Do I have a second?
This is Juniper Davis. I'll second.
Okay. Any discussion on the item? If not, all in favor of approval, say aye.
All right.
Aye. Aye.
Okay. Anyone opposed? No. All right, that passes. All right, we'll move to public comment. This is the time for any public that are here to comment on any agenda items that are not on the agenda. Do we have anybody online?
I don't see any public in the attendees list.
Okay. All right. And we will move on to new business. Agenda 4.1, presentation on the Reserve Street Community Input Final Report. John?
Thank you. Are you able to hear me and see the screen okay?
Yes.
Awesome. So yeah, my name is John Sand, transportation planner with the Missoula Metropolitan Planning Organization. We are here with Rachel from Fifth House Consulting to provide an update on the Reserve Street Community Input Project. This started off in January of 2020, where we had a community input forum in late January, pre-COVID, when this process kicked off. And that was the last time we came to TTAC, was to provide an update at that community input forum. Since then, a lot of work has been going on with some adjustments due to COVID. So we continued the process with stakeholder interviews, key informant interviews, and case studies. And Rachel, you are free to pop in here whenever you want to chime in, to add anything. So we had a really successful community input forum where we had learning and sharing stations, and got a lot of good input from the community, and had an opportunity to share with folks more about the planning process and constraints and stuff like that with the Reserve Street corridor. Rachel, before we move on, is there anything you'd like to add about the process for this planning or community input project?
Sure. So the input project that we did, we had a survey that went out prior to this so that we could understand what people were interested in talking about at the forum. And the process was about what are people's experience of Reserve Street. And it really was to have a opportunity for people to tell us what it really is like for them to use it and what they would like it to be liked. And the idea was that this would be information that would allow us, or the MPO in the future, to look back on when they were looking at the long range transportation plan or other plans, to see what it was that people's use and desires were, their dislikes and their likes. And so we discovered that people really wanted to learn about some of the kind of projects that were already going on that they didn't necessarily know about. And that really is due to not the MPO not putting the information out there, but more, it's a really challenging time to know where to find information. So that was a really big part, was having the learning station. We had 3 different learning stations, and people were allowed to ask questions and get their questions answered right there. And then the sharing stations were where they got to say, what is that experience like for them now, and what would they like it to be? From that process, we also had questions, like little pieces of paper that they could write their questions on, and we collected all of them. And so we analyzed all the data from the questions, from the surveys that we did. We also had user surveys at the event. And we took that information to say, okay, people still have questions about, these issues. And that's where we decided who to do key informant interviews with. And it was really to talk about the issues that people were having, or the concerns that they had, and why certain things happened, like questions as if, can we put a bus line down Reserve Street? Or what would it be like to change all our lights? Or how do we, kind of clean the street, things of this nature. And so the key informant interviews was a process of really answering some of those questions. And that's what allowed us in the report to come up with, this is what is happening, this is what we need to do, and this is what could happen. The stakeholder interviews, because we didn't have the opportunity to do focus groups due to COVID, and it was right in the beginning when we were doing this, we were not going to run them online because a lot of people still didn't have video capabilities, and we wanted to reach people that are not always easy to reach. So from the people that came to the community input forum, we identified certain types of people, like a cyclist or a family, that lives on Reserve Street, a farmer, somebody that's a commuter. So we had about 6 different categories of people, somebody that was used a wheelchair. And we did case studies around them and had in-depth interviews. So that's what those 3 components of this process looked like.
Great, thank you, Rachel. This next slide may look familiar to you, but this was part of, this process we went through for the Reserve Street Community Input Project, was educating the community on decision points during a public planning project. So this is a graphic that is relevant to many planning projects, but just making sure a visual representation of the points in the planning process when the community can provide their input, and all the other decision making, data, policy that goes into the planning process.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jen.
Oh, you're good.
No, I was going to say that a big reason that we did this is it seemed like people didn't really always understand everything that went into a planning process. And we wanted to make sure that they knew where their voice was important. And then also that we value their input and we value their voices, but there's all these other components that have to match to make a project be successful. And so that was our goal with creating this graphic. And it seemed like people that took the time to look at it, and we handed it out to every individual in the packet at the community input process. It was another way that they could see, oh, okay, there's a whole lot more than me just saying, I would like, longer crosswalk times or lights to be changed. So.
Yeah, thanks for that addition, Rachel. And so one of the fun things that happened at the community input forum that I feel folks really valued and kind of build off of this graphic is sharing with us of what they were experiencing on Reserve Street. So there were graphic recorders there, drawing as people were making comments. So some of this stuff, unfriendly, congested, rural, rural feel, lack of access. And so really visually gathering what folks were experiencing on Reserve Street today. And that was a big part of the goal of this project, is to understand how different users use Reserve Street, and their perception of it. And then the other graphic recording station was what you'd like to see the future of Reserve Street. So really fun ideas here, everything from solar array, solar panels, there's gondola there, around roundabouts, stuff like that. So another way of gathering public input in a kind of fun, different way. So the next part, we're going to share a video that we put together for this project. It's about 4 or 5 minutes. We're going to play that, and then we'll talk about next steps and recommendations after the video plays.
Welcome to the Reserve Street Community Input Project presentation. On January 29, 2020, the Missoula Metropolitan Planning Organization, MPO, partnered with Fifth House Consulting with the purpose of understanding Missoulians' lived experience of Reserve Street and what they believe would improve this experience. Then Fifth House Consulting took your questions and recommendations and took a deeper dive by interviewing key community members and city, county, and state staff who gave input on the proposed recommendations we will be sharing. First, let's review. What is Reserve Street? Reserve Street is a federal highway and a core route in Missoula's transportation network. It's heavily traveled by local commuters, visitors, and people shopping from surrounding counties. Reserve Street is a regional economic center, which adds to the daily congestion. Vehicle counts vary from 38,000 to 43,000 a day. Now let's review who uses Reserve Street. We have cyclists, shoppers, farmers, people with disabilities, commuters, and people that pass through traveling. The MPO cares about them all. The goal of this project was to gather community input to aid in the planning of the Long Range Transportation Plan. LRTP is a multimodal transportation plan, updated every 4 years, that considers the growth and development of a regional transportation system. It's important to note that this is a long-term plan, and, like all changes to city infrastructure, will take time to implement. This graphic shows the 4 overarching stages of decision-making during the development process for creating a public space. Community input is vital at each step. Together, MPO and Fifth House Consulting collected feedback from the community to initiate Step 1, planning. We used a variety of methods to gather diverse perspectives and insights from Missoulians, elected officials, and agency staff. This was done through 2 public surveys, a community forum, interviews with key community members and city, county, and state staff, and case studies with individual Missoulians. Many commented on the good aspects of Reserve Street. Some liked that parts of Reserve Street were still quite rural. Some talked about how convenient local store access was. Their concerns were primarily heavy trafficking and congestion, road rage or unsafe driving habits, and a general perception that the industrial sections of Reserve Street are ugly and are not the best face to put forward to tourists coming into town. After 9 months of gathering information, recommendations were broken up into 3 categories: shorter-term planning recommendations the MPO can look into, long-term planning recommendations for the MPO, and recommendations that the everyday Missoulian can do to help. Here are some areas the MPO is already working on, as well as some areas they can look into to improve the quality of the user's experience on Reserve Street. Update signal technology to optimize the flow of traffic. One of the ways the MPO and MDT are looking at traffic and congestion is through signal optimization and new technology, often referred to as Intelligent Traffic Signals, or ITS. A recent study by MDT, funded through a Federal Accelerating Innovation Deployment, or AID grant, examined the traffic operations of 2 corridors in Missoula, Reserve Street and Brooks. The results of that study indicated some potential for improved traffic flow through signal timing optimization and other new technologies designed to respond to changes in traffic patterns. However, the corridor also has some issues and constraints, including queue lengths, cross-street signal needs for both traffic and longer pedestrian crossing times, lane configuration imbalances, and left turn timings. Work to facilitate updates to local transit service, like the Mountain Line, to decrease vehicle congestion. Currently, Mountain Line services Reserve Street behind the big box stores. This is the safest and most efficient way to provide public transport at present. Should future transformations reimagine Reserve Street, the MPO and Mountain Line will continue to work together to decrease vehicle congestion. Create safe pedestrian road crossings and design pedestrian-friendly sidewalks to allow for more foot traffic, and design protected bicycle facilities. Provide incentive for efficient transportation modes like walking or biking, and build a grid system by creating alternative routes that connect side streets to major arteries. This can help spread the congestion out. For instance,
let's see. Sorry about that. I don't know what happened.
it's like walking or biking, and build a grid system by creating alternative routes that connect side streets to major arteries. This can help spread the congestion out. For instance, one of the primary goals of the Russell Street project is to reduce pressure on Reserve Street through increased capacity on an alternate route. While the project is still new and not fully constructed, early evidence indicates that some traffic is choosing Russell Street over Reserve Street. Focus on the beautification of Reserve Street. Investments in some more modern, water-wise, and low-maintenance type of landscaping would make this area fit in with the feel of Missoula. Relatively low-cost improvements can significantly transform the way a street looks, which can then transform the way people feel. For example, trees and flowers, along with attractive signage and flags, help people feel proud, positive, and calm. And continue to keep community members involved to remain in touch with the greater desires of the Missoulian citizens. When making these recommendations, we acknowledge that changes to Reserve Street will call for multi-jurisdictional coordination. Decision-making for this route isn't left only to MDT, the city, or county, but instead requires a complex relationship among all of those jurisdictions. The MPO's role is to ensure coordinated and comprehensive planning for solutions within this partnership. Now it's your turn to learn what you can do to help. First, stay aware, informed, and contribute. Continue to show up, keep in mind that these things take time, and remember that it's your input that will create the framework for change. Institute a positive culture framework. This means trying to notice the positive. When do things go well? How can you pay attention to the positive social norms? Try to take note of what does work for the community. Don't be a distracted driver and remind others to not be distracted. Ask yourself, can this call or text wait? Encourage yourself and those around you to practice patience and focus when they're behind the wheel. Be proactive about safety. We all want Reserve Street to be safe. Ask yourself, what does it mean for me to be a safe driver? What does it mean to be looking out for not just my safety, but your safety? Another example would be, I wear a seatbelt, and I would ask that you wear a seatbelt. Or, I do not text and drive, so I would ask that you do not text and drive. We can all adopt the mindset, it's not just my safety, but our safety. And remember, be kind. We all have the same goals. Thanks to you, Reserve Street will become a safer, less congested, and more beautiful part of Missoulians' daily life. Remember to stay engaged and informed.
Great. Can you all still hear me? I think so. So yeah, before we open it up for discussion, just here is kind of a comprehensive list of recommendations that can be found in the plan, which is available on our website, MissoulaMPO.com. So that is kind of all I have for the update for the Reserve Street Community Input Project. I'm not sure if Aaron has anything to add or Rachel, but I figured if there's some discussion around recommendations, we could have that, or any other questions about the process.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is to really thank Rachel and Fifth House Consulting for the work on this. It was a little bit of I think a different process than we often think of in terms of what we do in planning. The intention going in, as Rachel and John mentioned, wasn't necessarily to come up with a plan or do a corridor study for Reserve Street. It was really to get that, to help with our engagement on the community on this issue, and to think of ways that we can better understand how the community is interacting with Reserve Street, and have that then inform future work that we're doing, whether that's pedestrian crossing studies or a corridor study or other investments through the long range transportation plan. And I really thought that Rachel did a fantastic job taking something that could be a really contentious and negative issue, at least the way we talk about Reserve Street, and trying to make that a process that felt productive both for ourselves as the MPO and for the public who was participating. And I think we had generally well-received feedback both on the community forum and the rest of the process. So it was fun to do this. I think like I said, it could have been not the most fun to talk about and focus on Reserve Street, but it gives us something to work with and think about what Reserve Street is doing well, in addition to the things that maybe it's not. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that because we're trying to fix problems and we're not necessarily thinking about, the fact that Reserve Street is a regional corridor and it's providing all of these totally different uses, whether it's commuters or people traveling through on the highway, or as one of our major commercial centers in Missoula. There's just a whole lot going on there, and it's doing a lot of that reasonably well. So again, thanks to Rachel for her work on this, and hopefully this is a useful piece of information for us moving forward. And be curious to know what folks think about, how we might approach this or ways that we could use this to influence the work that we're doing moving forward. So that's all I have to add. Thanks, John and Rachel.
Great, thank you for that. Anybody have questions or comments? I'll start us off. I have a question. So out of the recommendations that were listed up there, which of those is going to give us the biggest bang for our buck on Reserve Street? I guess, and which will be the easiest to implement?
Those
Super short question.
those might be two totally different things. I don't know what the biggest bang for the buck is going to be necessarily. I think signal timing and ITS could be a really, from an infrastructure side, could be an option. I don't think it's going to solve all of our problems because there are capacity issues, but it could help to sort of smooth out some of the issues that we see on Reserve Street and think about how we're managing the existing traffic demand. And that's one that we've been exploring through CMAQ funding or other options. And it came up in the long range transportation plan. So that might be one. And then I think some of I don't know that we necessarily know exactly how to do it, but I think there's a lot of good guidance out there, but that kind of positive cultural framework that we talked about and some of the ways that we're talking about safety and use of Reserve Street and trying to shift the dialogue away from Reserve Street is the worst thing in Missoula to Reserve Street is doing a lot of things really well. And there are things that we can do in our individual day-to-day lives that will help make it better, whether it's the distracted driving or trying to reduce road rage and some of those other things that just, every crash that's there just makes Reserve Street worse. So that might be something that as part of our, think about as a kind of educational campaign or partnering with MDT on some of the more direct outreach and engaging with people and trying to get them to interact with Reserve Street differently. I don't know, Rachel, did you have any thoughts on?
Yeah, I think some of the low hanging fruit that could be easy in that I interviewed Jay Otto of the Center for Health and Safety and Culture, who does a lot of work with transportation departments around the country. He talked about the smaller low hanging fruit of beautification. And that is one thing that people said they wanted was, couldn't the strips look nicer? And he said that there's a real change that people have when they go to a place and it feels good. Just like some of the beautification that happened in downtown, where now we have hanging baskets and flags and there's a spirit to the place. He talked about that being a very big just kind of something that's easy to do. It does take coordination. And that was something that definitely I heard that the coordination would have to happen between, the city Parks and Rec, because they're in charge of actually maintaining landscaping, and then some of the other business owners, if they own part of the land there. Then the positive framework culture is a safety culture. And he also spoke about that can take 2 to 3 years to change the language. And the language is about noticing that if we can notice the good things and also take responsibility for our personal actions, that goes a very long way and doesn't necessarily cost a lot of money the way that infrastructure costs a lot of money. And an interesting question that we asked on the survey was, do you feel like you are a good driver? And people said, yes, I'm a good driver. I'm safe there. And then was the reverse question is, do you feel other people are good drivers on Reserve Street? And the majority of people said, no, other people aren't good drivers. So if they're all good drivers and nobody else is a good driver, and granted, it was a small pool of people that answered that question, but it just kind of, we know that we always think we are doing better. So I do believe a public health campaign, kind of boosting up the distracted driver campaign on that street and in that area, something like that, I think could go a long way, especially since we already have that infrastructure and prevention specialist who's working on that in our city, in our county. So Emily, you had your hand raised, I thought.
I was wondering if it came up, so anecdotally, since, and I think it's first of all, really great job on the public involvement. It's nice to see us approaching it a little bit differently. Sometimes I think we get, for the past 5 or 10 years, I think we've been caught in a little bit of a rut with kind of doing charrettes all the same way. And so I think it's nice to see some creativity around it. And I thought the video was really easy to follow too. Anecdotally, just sort of from my own experience on Reserve Street, did anything come up about wayfinding? Because when I think about distracted driving and looking at my cell phone on Reserve Street, I realize that I can never remember what the heck is behind the pads. Like, where is Lowe's and where is Target? And so even coming from West Broadway, which left do I take to avoid Reserve Street to get to here? And so wayfinding for some of those places, and I know we can't kind of advertise the actual store, but kind of understanding where you are on West Broadway as it orients to Reserve, and then also where you are on Reserve as it orients, like, okay, do I go under, the interstate to get to sort of a corridor? Which side is it on? And then I'm like checking my phone. And so did that come up at all, or is there anything we could do with that?
It didn't come up in any of the meetings that we had or any of the interviews, and it could be because the people that came lived around it, Reserve Street, and were intimately involved in it, or they had businesses on Reserve Street. So they might be using that corridor every day and have a sense of it, but it's an interesting idea. And I think your idea has merit. So that would now punt it over to Aaron or John to answer if it's possible.
Yeah, it's an interesting question and something I think we could follow up on, just in terms of route wayfinding, and it falls into that distracted driving, people using their phones more, and they're using their phones for wayfinding instead of looking at a map, knowing where they need to go, and then making their trip. I think people just spend less time trying to figure out where things are before they go instead of doing it during the drive. So that might be part of that overall distracted driving campaign, something to think about. And then sign clutter too, like, are there too many signs? How do we organize our signs for businesses? Is involving them in some wayfinding, and making sure that those elements are there.
Well, and I think even maybe some of the things that you're talking about with beautification could be relevant too, because I think part of the problem is that when you're driving on Reserve, it all looks the same, right? And so there's no way to orient yourself. Like, if you're downtown, you got the M or whatever, there's no way to kind of know where you are. And so even some public art or something that kind of orients you to where you are and where things are in relation. I just find myself just getting really kind of disoriented back there.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Karen, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I really appreciate the outreach and the public engagement in this project. I thought it was great. I was wondering, the timeline for getting the report out compared to the long range transportation plan is a little awkward because the plan is already done and adopted. Now we're seeing this. I'm curious what are kind of some of the key things that definitely got incorporated into the long range transportation plan. And I wonder if there's an opportunity for some additional outreach to highlight some of those things so that you can report back to, or maybe you already have, report back to the community, like, how did this influence the long range transportation plan?
Yeah, so some of it was related to things like it fed into some of the recommendations around signal technology and signal timing, and how that might be emphasized as a program or project that we should move forward. We also included some of these ideas around that kind of North Reserve, Scott Street area, and the infrastructure and the ways that we were looking at that, to try to, again, look at how Reserve Street fits into that area and what improvements might be necessary. And then I think just in general, the public outreach on this gave us a lot of good background information that we could then, sort of an ongoing public involvement piece that we integrated into our overall long range plan. And I think there was some crossover engagement there. The people who had started getting engaged with the Reserve Street project then participated in meetings for the long range plan. So we had some dedicated sort of Reserve Street kind of, not neighborhood exactly, but interested stakeholder meetings, and we used our contact lists from this project to get people. So I think it had built some engagement ahead of time, because the Reserve Street Community Input Project started ahead of the long range plan, and then sort of, for a whole variety of reasons, fell behind a little bit just in terms of project completion. But it did give us that initial engagement and got some people involved who I don't think otherwise would have been. I don't know if that answers your question fully, Karen, but
No, it does. Is there a need to report back to the folks who were involved and say, hey, you did, yes, our report is done after the long range transportation plan, but here's how your input influenced it. And just, I don't know. It seems like this kind of dialogue is part of what's needed to let people know how their input's used, and so that they can understand that. Maybe that has been done. I'm not sure.
Yeah, we did have a follow-up where we presented the report and things back to the folks who participated, and we talked a little bit about how it's continuing to influence the work that's moving forward. And I think this type of engagement is really critical in between long-range plan updates or plan updates. Just create that ongoing communication with people, both about specific topics like Reserve Street, but also just the long-range plan. I think it's a really good model of there being a little bit of education and input at the same time, that we don't often do that, or that we don't do it as well as I think we could. You want people to be engaged and building their familiarity and knowledge of these processes before you get to the point where you're doing a plan, because then you're on a schedule and you're moving, and it's hard to do that like during a long range plan update. So if we can build that capacity in between updates, I think we'll get further.
Great. Thank you for this. That was really insightful. And I know that most of us have opinions about Reserve Street, so this is really good. All right, let's move on to agenda item 4.2. Ben Brewer is with us. He's going to give a presentation on the Our Missoula Growth Policy 5-year review. Take it away, Ben.
Thank you. My name is Ben Brewer, and I'm a supervisor in the Community Planning Division and CPDI. I'm happy to be here with you today to talk about this. Is it too late to just make one more comment on that last item? I know we've transitioned here.
Yeah, I guess so. If you want to, go for it.
I just thank you. I'm coming from the land use end here, and so I'm really interested in kind of tackling Reserve Street or kind of looking at it through that lens. And I didn't kind of see it, and apologies if I missed it in the recommendations, but I didn't see kind of something for a land use approach to wrestling with reserve, and really interested in the idea of, it's such a one destination street where everybody's either going to North Reserve to shop or going to North Reserve to work, and then and traveling kind of up and down to get to that point, and wondering if there's kind of distribution of land uses farther south to serve people on the southern end of town, if that might kind of assist with some of the congestion issues and the overall experience. So just wanted to throw that out there. Thanks. All right, so I'm going to move on to my presentation, which is about our 5-year review of the growth policy. And we presented on this to Planning Board this week on Tuesday, and Aaron invited me to bring this to this group. So, and this is a great group to be able to kind of update on this and walk through a little bit of what we're thinking about with regard to this. So thanks for the opportunity. I'm gonna throw up a slideshow here and kind of walk through what we have put together, and then look to get any comments and questions that you might have afterwards. I'll try to keep the presentation to, sorry here, to 10 or 15 minutes and then leave some time for questions, hopefully. And feel free to interrupt or ask anything as I go. Can you all see my slide here, the title slide? I can't see you all, so just if there's
Yes, we can see it.
Okay,
We're good.
great. Great. So state, law requires that every 5 years that growth policies be reviewed and looked at to see if there's any need for revision, basically, and to examine the timetable that it's based on, and basically the language in state law is that at least once every 5 years it's reviewed and looked at and to determine if revising the policy is necessary or not. So our approach to the review was to kind of conduct it based on our criteria and with aiming towards some kind of a determination on whether there is a need or it is necessary or not to conduct any changes or take through any updates or modifications. So, and just to be kind of clear from the beginning, for where we are right now, this project, it is a review specifically. We're not in any update phase currently, although we do anticipate heading in that direction coming out of this. And so I'll talk more about that moving on here. But so, besides being required to do this, we wanted to approach this and take this as an opportunity really to take stock of the growth policy and review and evaluate it and having a chance to step back and see if it's still doing what we had hoped it would do when it was adopted, and if it still kind of accurately captures the vision for the community. A lot of you are probably familiar with the growth policy, but just as a quick recap, I'm going to take you through what it includes. It's basically the growth policy document and the supporting materials. So the document includes an introduction that includes the vision, kind of the condensed vision statement for the policy, as well as a description of how it's organized and whatnot. And then the bulk of the policy are what we call the 6 elements. And those are the chapters that really contain the policy statements themselves. So that includes the goals and objectives. And it's they're divided up into these 6 categories, which were kind of how we organized how we'd approach the visioning for the document: livability, safety and wellness, economic health, housing, community design, and environmental quality. And then following that, and these are basically the chapters in the growth policy document. So following that is a actions and outcomes section, which contains the list of growth policy actions, proposed actions. And those are divided up between kind of a focus list of priority actions and then the full list of actions as well. And then moving on from there, the policy contains the land use recommendations chapter, which describes what the different land use designations are and kind of how they what they mean and how they should be interpreted. There's a cooperation and coordination chapter, a chapter guiding subdivision regulations, and finally a growth policy amendment processes chapter. And that's where we find the review criteria that we based our review on, but there's other things there as well, of course. And then the other main material that goes, that's part of the policy, is the future land use map, which is how the growth policy is applied to the Missoula area, which includes the city proper and then the area outside of the city limits that are within what's called the growth policy boundary. And again, the map really ties back to that land use recommendations chapter. And then finally, included with the growth policy document are various appendices which supplement the policy. By far, kind of the most prominent one, I guess, is the community profile, which includes the data and demographic information that's supported coming to the guided, creating the policy in the first place. But there's a variety of other things in there as well. So what was reviewed? We based our review on, I think it's 9 specific review criteria that are included in the growth policy itself that were added in there when the growth policy was created. And they're listed here. I'll read through them. I'm not gonna go through the analysis for each one in this presentation, but I'll show you where that can be found. But basically, we looked at changes in the legal framework since the growth policy was implemented, which there was not any. Significant changes in existing conditions and projected trends, changes in the circumstances which the goals and objectives were based, changes in community goals, the degree to which meeting goals and objectives have been met, completion of implementation strategies, deviation from implementation timetable, public input, including suggesting the need to make changes, and finally, knowledge of specific and identifiable amendments that would improve the growth policy's usefulness so that it better serves the public. And just to clarify, the review up until this point was conducted by myself and those of us in the community planning division and CPDI, and then we were assisted by a interdepartmental functional working group that included members from several kind of agencies and departments and divisions throughout the city and the county. I think Charlie is here, who is a member of that group, and it included, I think, 7 or 8 folks on that, and that was a valuable resource for us as we were putting this together to be able to check in with, get guidance from, get assistance in some cases when we needed it. So the review, the product of the review was basically a series of materials which are provided on an Engage Missoula page. I'm gonna take a break from the PowerPoint and kind of walk through what's in that page here. But basically, how we're presenting our review is through a report. And so there's a kind of the report itself, and then we have a variety of supplemental materials that we included as appendices. I'm going to take a break from the PowerPoint for a second and bring up the Engage Missoula page here. Can everybody see the Engage Missoula page? Is it coming up okay? All
Yep.
right. Great. So this includes basically a description of the project, and then on the sides here, these are kind of where you can find information on the project. And so we've already been to Planning Board earlier this week, and then we'll be visiting the Land Use and Planning Committee of City Council to present kind of our final version of the report later this month. And there's contact information here for people involved in the project, and then the materials themselves are all provided here. And so if you have interest on this, or what kind of more in a more detailed way, I would definitely point you to this. It involves the report itself, which again is basically organized by these individual criteria and our responses to them, and kind of what our analysis was of those. And then again, the individual appendices are all listed here. So we have a appendix. Oops, sorry, that's not what was here. Appendix A is our list of recommendations for potential updates to the growth policy, which are listed here in kind of more detail. Appendix B is a list of all the policies and plans as best as we could collate that have been adopted since the adoption of the growth policy. So basically in the last 5 or 6 years. It's quite a list, and it's pretty interesting to look through. And I think for this group, it's something that you should all, and we should all maybe feel proud about. It's to me, I find it pretty impressive. Appendix C was an update to our kind of implementation actions report that where we are reporting on which priority actions are being or have been implemented. There's a lot of specific information in here about how each individual growth policy action is being carried through or carried out or not, to more or less degrees in this appendix here. So that's just to kind of walk you through the main appendices. The rest of these are kind of more supplemental to some of the language in the report. And then just to get to the kind of conclusion of the report, basically, this was leading to some kind of a determination. And what we concluded was that, yes, updates to the growth policy are warranted, we think, and so that's our recommendation. I put some kind of key takeaways just coming out of this process here, just kind of for you to think about as we keep going through this. One is that the volume of policy work that's been done since we adopted the growth policy is just it's a lot. It's an impressive amount, I think, but the implementation of that policy is needing to catch up. And kind of related to that, the growth policy can be used and should be used, I think, to help kind of with coordination between all of this policy work. We found for a lot of the criteria that kind of asked about changing trends or changes in conditions and whatnot that led to the growth policy vision. And generally we didn't find that those had changed much, but that a variety of them are heightened basically, or more. There's more of an urgency to them. So things like the housing issues, climate issues, and whatnot, and then issues surrounding equity, or kind of not that they're not addressed in the growth policy as it is, but there is a sense of more urgency for some of these. An exception to what's not already what we see as being included in the policy was issues surrounding COVID and the pandemic. So that was kind of our general take as far as what the pressing challenges are for the community. We're looking forward to updating the community profile. It's not something we have done yet as part of this project, largely because of the availability of the census data. But I think we expect that to be an important update. But again, it's not likely to capture everything, especially as related to the pandemic in the last year or two. And then finally, we as part of this review, we brought our actions update, to up to speed with or up to current present day. And for the most part, it showed that we have really been keeping up with implementing at least our priority actions, which was good to see. So I was going to run through with this group kind of just generally what our recommendations are as far as updates to the growth policy could be. And then, I'd really hope to use this time to hear your thoughts on that and point to things that we may not be considering yet or should be considering more so or differently, especially as relates to transportation. So we basically broke up our recommendations into 3 categories. First is kind of just technical maintenance to the document. And one of the big ones there is updating the community profile. But we also we're really interested in exploring streamlining the policy and or kind of reorganizing it to have it be simpler and more usable. And then there's just kind of general maintenance that would be needed for new terms and things like that to be current. And then we kind of our second bucket would be policy work itself. And there's, again, this is a condensed version. So if you want more detail, I would recommend looking at that Appendix A list on the that's included with the report. But we have ideas for how we would want to incorporate the Our-Missoula development guide more into the policy itself. That's a report that we put out on growth in the Missoula area. We try to do it on a yearly basis. I think the one we're working on now is it's been 2 years since the last update. But it's evolved and it's turning into a pretty useful tool, I think. And so it's something that we want to explore, kind of how to integrate that some more. We are looking to evaluate and consider updates and changes to the land use map. And that's kind of in a variety of ways. Again, those are spelled out a little more in that list, and I'm happy to talk more about what that might include. And similarly to our land use recommendations chapter and how those are interpreted and described. We're looking to clarify how issue and neighborhood plans inform the growth policy and vice versa. That kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier as far as how we coordinate between all this various policy work that we've been achieving. And then finally, we want to better address equity in the growth policy. And then our final kind of category for this was looking at implementation and usability. Usability was a big focus for us as we started this project. We are very close to having put together a user guide that we're looking to roll out soon coming out of this that we think we've heard a need for and think would be helpful. But also things like maybe more of a web presence or translating or transferring the document to the web, some potentially, and looking at more usability with the data. And then the other thing that we've talked about is how to track and kind of organize implementation of the growth policy and things like putting together an implementation team or reviving what used to be kind of more groups that used to be more active for that with the growth policy. And that's something that this group might have ideas about that we would definitely be interested to hear. And then finally, increasing public participation and engagement with things related to the growth policy. So those are kind of a shortened, condensed list of what we're recommending would be kind of our, as we move out of this review phase and into actual update work in the near future, that these are the things that we're wanting to focus on. And I wanted to end with kind of trying to locate where this review is in relation to future work on the growth policy and other projects that are kind of on the docket and in the works already at the city. So we're at the review project is the upper set of rows with that are colored, and we're really aiming to be towards the end of this review phase in October, with having reported to planning board this week and looking to finalize the report for city council, and then flowing out of that and with depending on what feedback we get and guidance from city council, we see the next steps kind of broken out here in these in the rows below. So there's a education and outreach effort that we want to pursue, especially as far as rolling out the user guide and having that as an available resource and being able to provide trainings and workshops and what kind of that kind of thing, I think would be helpful. There are specific growth policy amendments that we know we want to work on moving forward with this, especially as updating the community profile and the OMDG update. And then additional work is going to really tie into the comprehensive code reform initiative that's rolling out or gearing up to roll out soon or towards the end of this year as well. And that is listed below the growth policy amendments and really begins with an audit process that would follow, the RFP process to select consultants for that work. So, a lot of what we're recommending here is going to tie into and be informed by what comes out of that audit work. And so there's a lot of coordination that we see happening between those two projects. But still, at the same time, we're already working on targeted subdivision regulations updates that are mainly focused on responding to state law changes recently. There is a transportation options action plan and recommendation report that's in the works now that will also influence and tie into this work, especially the code reform work, I think. And then there's also housing incentives work that's being done already, and will inform this as well. And so we see, again, just to say that these recommendations are a starting point. We're looking at this review as a starting point of a pretty big conversation that ties into a lot that's being done and we hope to be done coming up here shortly. And so at this point, we're really kind of in a conversation starting mode, and the more feedback we get now and guidance and whatnot from groups like this, the more we can use to help set up some of these other initiatives that are coming down the line here pretty soon. So that's kind of what I had to present today, and I'm happy to talk more about it or answer any questions you might have.
Great. Thanks, Ben. It looks like a big undertaking. Emily, you had a hand up.
I was curious about, you said you had county people on the review team. Who was that, and getting county people on the kind of the steering committee for the process. And then my second question is the city planning on just start the last growth policy, when our Missoula was written, it just started with the underlying assumption of, focus inward. And is the city going to keep that, or are we going to start to really kind of look at some of the urban fringe areas, considering our housing crisis? In the county, we're really concerned about, if we don't get sewer and water in some of these urban fringe areas, we're going to keep seeing low density housing, and it's really going to impact our ability to see the density we want to make an impact on the housing market. And so, is there any way to kind of rethink the underlying focus inward piece, and how do we, as a county, staff get on the process to start having those conversations?
Yeah, that's a great question. To answer your first question, the working group members from the county are Caroline Lauer, that's in the climate, and Lisa Biskevich with the health department, are the two that those are the two representatives that are with the county currently.
So do you think we could add some folks from our planning office?
Okay, yeah, I see. That's a great question. And I think I will say, this, we're anticipating kind of, I don't know if reevaluating is the right word, but like a check-in on our working group to see who still has capacity and whether it's still has, people are on it who should be and whatnot. So there's going to be room to to look at that coming up shortly. So that's a great suggestion. I think another thing for us to think about for that is that the structure for the code reform work is multi-tiered, at least the way we're envisioning it. And so there's going to be a variety of those types of groups to plug into. And so I'm just to say that I'm not sure that that is the one that necessarily makes the most sense for those considerations, but that so we need to kind of identify what would make the most sense. And then to answer your second question, yeah, absolutely. I think that's something we want to re-examine and be considering as part of this is kind of what, I mean, if nothing else, to clarify what focus inward means, because I think there's some confusion about that. So just from a clarity level, I think that's important. But I think, at planning board, we were asked questions about how does this tie into the county zoning project currently and kind of their update to the land uses that was done recently. And so I think that, that in our list of recommendations, we included that under the mapping, exploring mapping changes. But I think that kind of ties into, or basically at the heart of that is some conversation or something to kind of come to terms between the city and the county as far as what the expectation is for what's going on in the land, in the growth policy area boundary that's outside of the city limits currently, and how do we relate to what the county's doing, and are we getting on board, or are there differences that we need to reconcile? And so I see that as a fairly big conversation in itself, but it's something that we have
it's on your radar. It will be a conversation. Yeah.
Yeah.
Got it.
Aaron?
Yeah, I was just that conversation, just thinking about spurring a little conversation for this group, or just things to think about is we related to what Emily was saying about growth in fringe areas. And I think we tried to look at some of that maybe in the long range transportation plan, but it could be a good role for this group to look at some of those potential changes, whether it's in land use maps or growth policy updates or zoning changes, to look at how that meshes with where we're proposing to invest in infrastructure, and should we make some changes to what we're proposing, or do we even have the funding necessary to accommodate that, to take a real close look at those proposed growth changes and what does that mean for our transportation system in the long term, and especially this group where we have city and county and we have MDT in the room, because all of these things are going to affect all of the transportation, or mountain line, and potentially using this group as a way to look at some of those proposed changes and what does that mean for our transportation system, because I do think transportation is a good metric for how well some of these growth strategies are going to function long term. So just a thought there for this group to think about, and for Ben, for you or others, maybe even at the county, as we're making these growth decisions, this group could be a really good venue for having some discussions about what does that actually mean long term for our investments.
Yeah, that's a good idea. And I guess just to follow up on that really quick, sorry, Karen, to jump in here, but I guess I'll just say the way I've been thinking about that as far as focus inward, how it's kind of interpreted through the growth policy versus where some of the more recent planning and efforts and whatnot is that rather than kind of directly pointing inward to downtown Missoula, which I think is kind of how, there's kind of a what's the word, transect approach or idea of it, that it's like downtown should be the densest, and then it kind of gets less dense as you move out from there. That I think it seems like or at least my impression of kind of the county's approach now or vision is like constellation of compact community centers that are kind of in relation to each other and spread around the valley, where you have these kind of walkable destination community centers that are not necessarily only the downtown area. And so I think that's something that is not really in our city growth policy approach currently, but it's not, but it could be. But you know, it's a conversation that's would be needing to happen. And Karen would definitely want to hear your thoughts on anything about that.
I think it'd be great to collaborate on that. So I like Emily's idea of maybe including Andrew or someone with long range planning to move ahead and are in the process of thinking through amendments. I was curious about the user guide. It's kind of interesting timing wise to develop a user guide while you're also considering amending the growth policy. And I'm wondering what the value is of doing that, what you're thinking the value is of doing that now while you're going to go ahead and probably work on changes to the growth policy. And then what you're hoping to get out of that. I mean, what are you hoping that's achieved by that? I like the idea, but I'm just curious what you're thinking.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, as far as the timing goes, you know, I think that we don't have a set timeline or anything, but assuming that I guess we are assuming that updates will be folded into or coordinated with the code reform project, and that's not a quick project. So it's not like we don't really anticipate, a high volume or much of the updating happening for another at least year or two. That would be my guess, because it's going to be informed by the code reform project. So there's still and so that leaves what's happening currently, and I think there's something that's kind of come up with in relation to that and growth policy work and updating codes and whatnot is this kind of tension between the need and the desire to think of things comprehensively and to get all our ducks in a row and act accordingly, and then the urgency of what's happening right now and what are we gonna miss if we don't kind of get this up and running sooner. And so I think that's where the user guide could really be helpful and used to help clarify some of these and pull out kind of what the intent is of the growth policy for when these kind of issues come up or projects that come up where there's perceived conflicts between goals or between different policy directions. That's kind of the intent of it, is to help work through those issues that are confusing, and where the growth policy is great. It's robust, and it's got a really complete vision and set of statements and everything. But we've also kind of heard this comment on it or feedback that there's so much in it that you can find something to justify just about anything, and so that can lead to confusion when you need to land somewhere, and so that's part of the intent of the user guide, is to help kind of hone in on what it's really pointing to for in an individual context or scenario.
You have another question?
And then,
your hand still up? No. Okay.
And then just to follow up on that, Karen, the idea is that once the guide is there, we can always update that or have it evolve, as the growth policy evolves as well.
Ben, I have a question for you on, so maybe I missed this. Is this something typically the review ahead of staff do a review every 5 years or before a major update of the growth policy? Has that been practice?
I don't think so. I don't know that it's a precedent or anything. I mean, I think, and Karen, you probably know better than I do. I don't know how long the 5-year review requirement has been in state law, but this is our first review since this growth policy was adopted, and I think that it's entirely possible in some cases that you know, a review would be sufficient and that the growth policy is found to be doing what it's supposed to do and not need updates. That for us, I think it's just kind of tying into a period of time where we were already anticipating or kind of considering whether it was time to do some growth policy work, and especially as it relates to what we're trying to address and achieve through the code reform work.
The review requirement was put into statute when the growth policy statute was put in place back in the, whatever it was, 1999, 97, somewhere in there. And I think more or less the city and county had a combined growth policy once that statute came into place. And we more or less followed that review requirement. In most cases, I think we did updates along the way. This is the first time the city and county have each had their own growth policies under the growth policy statute, and we are continuing the practice of doing the reviews and determining what level of update is warranted. Where I don't think that either the city or the county is very good at doing reviews is for issue plans and neighborhood or community plans that have been done. We are rather notoriously terrible about keeping up to date on those plans. We have a tendency to get way out ahead and have a whole bunch of plans and never go back and look at them and see whether they are still relevant and whether they need updates or to be removed or whatever.
Okay. I know from Mountain Line standpoint, you know, our board of directors, we've been grappling with our transportation district boundaries really don't follow the city limits or county. It has pieces of both. Really grappling with how do we plan for future growth and what is that going to look like? And, you know, the best, you know, example that we have as a board is the growth policy boundary to really focus on. So for us, it's really important trying to understand what, you know, the city anticipates the growth to be and what the county anticipates the growth to be as far as on the fringes of Missoula and what would be eventually annexed into the city. So I think it's a really important document that you're working on, and I think a lot of people in the community would have a lot of opinions and input. So.
Just to add to that, the city, the county, and the MPO have all been really working to coordinate our growth projections, especially for that urban area. And so Aaron and Ben and Andrew have all been part of those conversations in the past, I think, where we try and keep that coordinated. And that's a relatively new thing that, well, since we've all been split apart into different jurisdictions, we've had to work at doing that. But I think we've been doing that pretty well. So that is something that we are working on.
Good. Fantastic. Any other questions?
Corey, just a thought here from my perspective, staff perspective, that there are a number of other opportunities, I think, for TTAC to be involved sort of on the fringes and from the transportation side, and directly coming out of the long range transportation plan that we had some of those program and policy recommendations, and we were trying to integrate land use into the long range plan. So it strikes me that there's a really good opportunity here to think about how we're integrating, say, Mountain Line's long range strategic plan that's coming up in the next year or so with the growth policy, and having some conversations about how do we move forward concepts like transit-oriented development, and what does that mean for our land use development piece, and how does that fit in with Mountain Line's long-range strategic plan? That there's a lot of crossover there, and they both sort of have to work together if they're going to work at all. so there's an opportunity there, and I don't know if that's a TTAC role or just coordination around the growth policy, but that's a recommendation that came directly out of the long range plan that I think we could have continued conversations or work on, whether it's through TTAC or these other processes. So something to think about there. And then I thought it was interesting. Something else to think about for this group and for transportation is with the neighborhood plans. To what extent do we want those to inform our transportation decisions? So it's, how do they fit into the growth policy and these other planning? But, to what extent do we want to integrate transportation into those neighborhood plans, and how can we do that? And what's the relationship then with the long range transportation plan? So I think there are some questions to answer there. And then the last piece, I guess, is just this idea of fiscal analysis that was included in the report, or in some of the recommendations that Ben's team put together. And I think that's really important when we're getting back to that question of how we're growing and where we're growing, and look at the actual fiscal analysis. And it's something that that the MPO has considered contributing to in the past. We've had it in our UPWP as a something that we would invest PL funds in. And so I think that's something we want to continue to think about it and look at. And then I guess last point, and this is maybe a question for MDT staff who are on the line. One of our other recommendations in the long range plan is on trying to integrate sort of functional classification and street design standards with land use better, and coming up with a system and a typology to really do that. And it's something we're interested in. I think we want to move forward with at a staff level as one of our projects. And sorry, to bring that back to a question for MDT, is thinking about sort of statewide process for the MPO's role in evaluating our urban system and functional classification, and how that might relate to future growth areas. And are there changes we want to make to support that? So MDT, like, what is the timing on that sort of statewide effort for looking at functional classification and urban system? And any thoughts on how we could better integrate that with the land use planning? So there's a long rambling thought, but try to end with a question.
Is my microphone working?
Yep.
Yes.
Yes. So this is Vicky, and what I can tell you right now is that the group that's been working on the statewide functional classification is still dutifully working on it, and I'm not exactly sure where they are on that project, but I can certainly delve deeper into that and let you know.
That might be something good for a presentation and discussion ahead of any potential decision making. So anticipating that a little bit, and being able to have the discussions at TTAC and TPCC before we're having to, well ahead of making any official decisions.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think, Aaron, your suggestion of TTAC being a good use, I think it'd be a good use of our time to be able to provide input, because you have such a wide, varied people on the board, or on the committee, excuse me. So, all right. You have anything else? We've got just a couple more minutes. No? Okay. Ben, thank you. This is really helpful, really insightful.
Same, I appreciate it.
Yeah. We are going to table 4.3 Mountain Line presentation to next month, since we are out of time. So from here, we'll move on to old business. Does anybody have old business that we need to take care of? Nope. None? Okay. Any announcements, closing comments from anyone? Okay, if there are none, then we'll be adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Everybody.